Hey there, Agile Koalas. Y'all are so cute, but in reality, you'd just rip my face clean off, wouldn't you? Welcome to another episode of Agile Bytes, the podcast put on by Integrity Inspired Solutions, where we are building software in an agile manner day in and day out. And I'd like to start today's episode with a short story that I think many of you can probably relate to. I was working at a startup whose primary product was a software as a service product. The CEO wanted to increase our rate of production. We just had a lot to get done. We had a lot of stakeholders interested in a lot of features that were in our pipeline, and we wanted to get these features out the door more quickly. So his first thought was what a lot of places' first thought is, and that is to hire more developers, right? Because obviously if we have more people writing code, then we're going to get more features done more quickly. And in truth, writing code is usually one of the longer activities that comes when we're producing software. So it does make a certain amount of sense, right? Let's hire more developers and we will get more features completed. This made sense until we actually started looking at our cumulative flow diagram. And what it revealed was the UI UX team had trouble actually getting designs out fast enough to the development team in order to keep the development team busy. We also discovered that the QA testers had a hard time keeping up with the output of the development team. The development team would often put things onto QA's plate faster than they could actually get it out the door from a testing perspective. So think about that for a minute. What would have happened if we would have just uncritically hired more developers? Well, we probably would have made the situation a lot worse, right? Because it turns out UI UX couldn't keep up with the demand that developers had downstream for work, and QA couldn't keep up with the output upstream that the development team was churning out. If we had added more developers, this situation only would have gotten worse. Everyone would have only gotten further behind. We would have only gone slower and spent more money to do it. What did we need to do? Well, probably we needed to hire more UI UX folks so that we could churn out more designs so that the development team could stay busy. And we probably need to hire more QA, more testers, so that the testing output from the development team could keep up with the actual outputs. The point is that development was not the constraint. Something else was the constraint. And so I want to talk today about how do you find your constraint? What is the constraint? Now, there's constraint with a lowercase c and there's constraint with a uppercase c, right? We all have constraints. Every team has things that provide bottlenecks or limits to how fast it can move. But I'm talking about the constraint, capital C, the way Eli Goldratt, rest in peace, might talk about the constraint. What is the one thing in your system that has the lowest throughput? In other words, out of all the different parts of your system, what is the part that is moving things through the smallest number at the slowest rate? Now, there's all kinds of legitimate reasons why that's the constraint. And every system has a constraint. Somebody has to be the constraint. Somebody has to be the controlling throughput. Again, there's all kinds of reasons. It could be that we just have fewer people doing that job. It could be that the nature of that work, like coding, for example, just takes the longest time out of the other things in the process that need to happen. Perhaps that work requires a skill set that's in very high demand in our organization, so the resources available get allocated amongst all different projects or all different teams or whatever. There's all kinds of reasons the constraint might be the constraint. I don't want constraint to have a negative connotation. It doesn't. There's nothing negative about it at all. It just means that every system is going to have some portion of the stream where work doesn't go as quickly as it does in other portions of the stream. And because of that, the constraint de facto controls the rate of speed of the whole system. Ultimately, we're trying to get items into production, right? But your system can only move as fast as your slowest piece, okay? Whatever the link in the chain is that's the weakest. Again, I hate to use that analogy because it makes it sound like the constraint is bad or the constraint is weak. That's not true. But it just means that the whole system can only move as fast, really, as the constraint. And if other pieces of your system are moving faster than your constraint, then you are probably creating log jams in your system. So That's why it's important to find your actual constraint, because in order for the constraint not to be a total disaster, the whole system has to take the constraint into account. And if it isn't, then the odds are pretty good you're creating massive backlogs of items that are sitting around waiting for someone to deal with it, depending on where your constraint is. And you probably have teams that are just sitting around starved for work all the time because the constraint can't pass work items through downstream as fast as other parts of your flow can. The reason that it's important to prevent this disaster, and the reason it's important to accurately identify your constraint, is because if you're trying to improve flow through your system, if you really are trying to get more items through your system and into production, it doesn't make any sense to improve anything that is not the constraint. You will not get much improvement by improving other things in the system. And in fact, you might be making the scenario a whole lot worse. Okay, for example, if you've got one tire on your car that rotates more slowly than the other three tires, it's not going to help you to speed up the other three tires, right? It's going to make it worse. You're just going to drive in circles all day. So the whole system has to take that constraint into account. And if I want to improve the speed of the whole system, it doesn't make sense to improve anything but that constraint. Let me give you a hypothetical situation. And this actually comes from Steve Tendon of TameFlow fame, a mentor of mine. TameFlow is amazing, amazing stuff if you're trying to apply the theory of constraints to knowledge work. And he used this analogy. Let's say you have two Agile coaches. And by the way, I'm not quoting, I'm just doing this off the top of my head. So I'm going to be randomly changing the names of the consultants and the number of days and things like that. But you'll get the gist. I know Steve, he's a great guy. He'll forgive me. But let's say you have a process where your average flow time for a feature or a user story or whatever, it spends 2 days in requirements gathering, it spends 7 days in development, and 3 days in testing. Those are just averages. We're just to make the math simple, let's say that's generally what happens. So we're trying to improve this system, and we've got one Agile coach who looks at this and they said, you know what? I have a suggestion that will shave 1 day off of testing. Okay, so that would make requirements gathering 2 days, development 7 days, just the same as it was. But testing goes from 3 days to 2 days. Let's say that's their suggestion. And then you have a second Agile coach, and their suggestion is, I can shave a day off of development, but it will add 2 days to testing. So requirements will still take 2 days. Development will only take 6 days. But now testing will take 5 days. Which one of those two coaches or consultants or whatever would you go with? Well, the fact that I asked that question probably means it's a trick, right? And probably it means that the right answer is the one that isn't the most intuitive. And that is correct. You want to go with the person who shaved the day off development and added 2 days to testing. Why? Because development is your constraint. Think about it like this. If we go with the first person's recommendation and we shave a day off of testing, well, we do get an extra day, but we only get it one time because once we've got that first feature done, that first feature was done a day earlier than previous features have been doing, but we can only go as fast as development. Testers can only get started when development is done. Right? They can't start any earlier. They have to wait for development to be done before they can start testing. And development still takes 7 days. It's still the constraint. So we pick up an extra day on the first feature, but that's it. That's it. So if we look at the next 20 features and we're trying to project how long those things are going to take, we picked up exactly 1 day of time savings. Because again, testing can't get started until development is done, and development takes just as long as it's always taken, right? But let's say we went with the second person's suggestion. Let's say that development only takes 6 days now, testing takes 5 days, but development takes a day less. Well, our first feature, yeah, it's going to take a day longer than normal, but our next feature, we break even. Why? Because testing could get started a day earlier than they could have before. Our next feature, we pick up a day. Our next feature, we pick up 2 days. Because every feature that rolls out, testing can get started a day earlier than they used to be able to start. And pretty soon, the time savings of that day is going to greatly eclipse any loss that we got from having an extra 2 days of testing. Where did that come from? Because development is the constraint. Development is the thing that controls how fast everything else can move. And if we can make a time savings there, we can add days all over the place until eventually something else becomes the constraint, and then we lose any benefits. But as long as we're improving the constraint, we are getting exponential time gains in our system. And that's why it's so important to find that constraint. Because if I just improve testing or I just improve requirements gathering, and they're not what takes the longest, they're not what's controlling the pace, I'm not really going to get a whole lot of benefit out of that. In fact, like I said, I might even possibly make things worse. So if you've not heard of this before, the theory of constraints, and Eli Goldratt really made this famous with his novel, The Goal, and he's written many other things about this. It's really all about how to manage your constraint and even how to leverage your constraint for your benefit. In this particular episode of the podcast, I'm going to focus primarily on how to find it. That is one of the very first things you need to do is identify the constraint. There's a lot more to be said about this. I'll be doing more episodes around the constraint and how to use it, how to leverage it, how to get the maximum efficiency you can once you found your constraint. But here we're going to focus mostly on how to find it. So if we're trying to find our constraint, usually one of the things that we have to do is get rid of our column-based WIP limits. You may be able to find your constraint and still have column-based WIP limits. It's possible. The only problem is our column-based WIP limits are usually set to manage flow problems. And so we have sort of WIP limited our way around our constraint. So a lot of times your column-based WIP limits obscure what your constraint actually is because you've set WIP limits up for a specific piece of the system to help its flow, but you're not really seeing where work items naturally collect and where work items naturally flow because they all pass through those artificial gates of the column-based WIP limits. Now, don't hear me wrong. Column-based WIP limits are not a bad way for teams to start limiting their work in process. In fact, I kind of recommend them. When you have no WIP limits whatsoever, starting with column-based WIP limits is a good way to kind of get your arms around that, a good way to start getting your WIP under control. But you don't want to stay there. And one of the reasons you don't want to stay there is because column-based WIP limits tend to obscure where a constraint actually is. In order to find your constraint, we got to see how work items are naturally flowing. We got to see how our natural capacities of our system work. And column-based WIP limits provide sort of an artificial gate, an artificial floodgate around that. Can sometimes make the constraint hard to find. So we're probably going to need to get rid of that. Now, we may choose to have like a system-wide WIP limit or something like that. That's fine. I think there are even better ways to manage your WIP than that. But the point is I don't want these little phase gates of WIP limits interfering with my experiment here. I do, however, have to lower my total WIP. If I want to find my constraint, I need to keep the WIP fairly low. So if you've got WIP busting out all over your system, if everybody is overworked, if everyone is backlogged, you're never going to find your constraint. Everybody looks like your constraint in an environment like that. What I need is for the water levels to drop so that the rocks start to become visible, right? So I need to start lowering my total WIP limit. Take a time period where you are not introducing new work into the system. You're just trying to get stuff out the door until things start to feel like a more natural flow. Well, what's going to happen when you do this is that your non-constraints are going to start running out of stuff to do. And so that kind of lets you know they're probably not the constraint. If you are trying to lower the WIP in your system and different groups start running out of stuff to do, that's probably not them then. They're probably not the constraint. What you're looking for is where does work start to build up? Imagine that you have a pipe that carries water and you know somewhere in your pipe there's a rock, but you don't know exactly where it is, but you do have flow sensors all along the pipe. Where will you start looking for that rock? Well, what you would do is you would look at those flow sensors and you would see where is the water starting to slow down? Where is it starting to bunch up? And then where all of a sudden do we have low flow? Well, wherever that point is, that's where the rock is, right? Because that water is bunching up in front of the rock. Downstream of that rock, the flow level is much lower than upstream. You're going to want to do the same thing in your Kanban board. Look for where that work is bunching up and where downstream of it, the flow is lower, where hardly anything is coming out the other side. That's where your constraint probably is. If you've got a group that is running out of work, it's not them. It's wherever that work is bunching up and then causing the downstream to be light. That's going to be your constraint. If you have a way to measure your flow time with each stage, then that may tell you where your constraint is. Oftentimes, it's whatever has the longest flow time. Not always, but most of the time. So if you've got low WIP and development has a lot of stuff in it, but other people are kind of running out of stuff to do and development is your longest flow time, that's probably your constraint. But it could be something else. But that is generally how we're going to find our constraint. So look for where the work is bunching up and causing items downstream or stages downstream to not have very many work items in it. Look where work is disappearing. Look where it's bunching up, just like the flow of water. That's where your constraint probably is. Who has the longest cycle time or the longest flow time? That'll probably give you a good indicator as well. So once you've found the constraint, what then? Well, this is where we start getting into things like the 5 focusing steps and other parts of the theory of constraints, and we will have other episodes to deal with those pieces. But just for the purposes of this episode, once you have found your constraint, here's some realities that you're going to have to deal with. And you have a constraint. Every system has one. The whole system is going to need to be adjusted to take into account that that's what your constraint is and what your constraint can do. There is no point in gathering requirements for features faster than your development team can develop features. There is no point in testing features faster than your development team can develop features. There is no point in developing features faster than your testers can test. Your whole system will need to take into account the fact that we have this constraint and here's how fast work can move through it. There's other things that you're going to need to do as well for that constraint, but that's the first dose of reality that you need, is that we need the whole system to realize that we have a constraint and we all need to respect that constraint. We all need to be helping that constraint. We all need to be protecting that constraint. We all need to be adjusting to the constraint. The other reality is, assuming we're trying to improve our flow, there's no reason to improve anything but the constraint. Now, we may choose to improve other things for other reasons, right? Maybe it just makes us happy. Maybe something just annoys us. Maybe somebody has really been down our throats to improve part of the process. And so in order to keep good relationships with the larger organization, we'll focus our improvement somewhere that isn't the constraint. We may choose to do that for various reasons, but strictly in terms of improving flow in our system, there's no reason to improve anything else. So we really want to zero in. In fact, if we improve the efficiency of things that are not the constraint, we may be making our picture a lot worse. But the other thing that I want to point out, and this is a little bit of a teaser for future episodes, is you may not want to do anything about the constraint per se, because every system has a constraint. And you can have a constraint that constantly moves around, and then you constantly adjust the system to whatever it is. Or you can strategically decide to place your constraint somewhere. Usually it's the part of the process that's the most expensive, or it's the hardest to hire for, or whatever. But you may choose to have the constraint in that specific spot so that you can plan around it. And once you've got that set, then you can start controlling WIP using that constraint, using drum buffer rope. That's something we'll talk about in a future episode. There are benefits to strategically deciding that a certain stage is going to be your constraint and keeping the constraint there. But again, there's a lot of things you have to do in your system in order for that to happen. So I hope that kind of whets your appetite a little bit. A constraint is not a bad thing. You have one. You have to have one. You can't get rid of it. You're always going to have the constraint somewhere in your system. The question is, are you aware of what it is? That's what this whole episode has been about. And once you're aware, how can we leverage it to create high-performing teams? And that's what we're going to be talking about in future episodes. Thanks, everyone, for listening to Agile Bites. Agile does sometimes bite, but we don't think it always has to. If you enjoyed what you heard today, don't forget to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you happen to be using. And if you can, leave us a comment, because we'd love to hear your feedback. What things would you like to hear about? What things did you hear that were valuable to you today? You can also head over to integrityinspired.com to sign up to our email list. But that's all for today, folks. We'll see you next time.